Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar with SOCi, the third annual Localized Marketing Benchmark Report. My name is Lizzie, and I'm a Senior Account Manager for Localogy, and I will be your host for today's event. A few housekeeping items before we begin. The webinar is being recorded and will be circulated to all attendees with the presentation within 24 hours of the broadcast. Questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end. You can, however, ask questions at any time during the broadcast by using the question window in your control panel. Our speakers today are Monica Ho, CMO at SOCi, and Mike Boland, Senior Analyst at Localogy. I will go ahead and pass it over to our speakers to introduce themselves, starting with Monica.
Thank you, Lizzie, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Lizzie mentioned, I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for SOCi. And for those unfamiliar with SOCi, we're a leading multi-location platform for centralizing a lot of the different things that marketers need to do to manage their localized digital brand. I'm very excited to be here today to help present out these findings, and I'll pass it back to Mike.
Thanks, Monica, and thanks, Lizzie, and hi, everyone. So for the sake of introduction, I'm Mike Boland, Senior Analyst at Localogy. I'm a 15-year tech industry analyst, most of that time covering local commerce and the orbiting technologies of that universe. And I was a big part of working with Monica on this report and this project to really formulate and execute a scoring model for the LMBR and write the resulting report. So very excited to be here today to tell you all about what we came up with. So why don't we actually get right into that? So Monica, if we go to the next slide, sort of jumping right into it, the first question is, what is the Localized Marketing Benchmark Report, or LMBR, as we call it? So the best way to think about this is that it quantifies and puts a tangible scoring system on the best practices in localized marketing. And that's something that we sort of talk about a lot and examine at Localogy, everything from search ranking factors to social engagement factors. So what this report does is essentially provide a standard unit of measurement, and therefore a set of tangible targets and best practices for brands or the agencies that represent them to aim for. So in cooperation with SOCi, we examined multi-location brand performance across the most influential channels for local buying decisions. So that's primarily search and social media, as we'll get into. And I'll also get into the sort of more granular methodology details to sort of set the stage in a minute. But first, if we go to the next slide to sort of further contextualize LMBR and how it can hopefully be valuable for brands and other entities in the local commerce sort of universe, there's the question of how you should be viewing this report and its results. And there are a few things we want you to keep in mind as you're sort of hearing this presentation or as you read the report itself. So as I mentioned, this creates a sort of standard unit of measurement. So there's a tangible target to hit. So by scoring performance across a number of search and social criteria, we were able to get a sense of what the average performance looks like, and that's our benchmark. So by evaluating someone's own performance or a given brand's own performance as an overall score or within the many criteria we tracked, a given brand can then sort of see not only how they stack up, but where exactly they need improvement and how they can achieve that. So if we go to the next slide, there's the question of, how do we do that? So starting with a very large data set from Places Scout, we applied a scoring model that quantifies top attributes for brand local presence in search and social scoring criteria. So remember that those are the two kind of main categories, and then it branches out. So the search score, every company gets a search score and a social score, and then a combined score, and we'll sort of get into those in a bit. And those scores were really the sort of total of all of the individual scores that a given brand receives in individual ranking criteria, which I'll get into in a second. And we executed this scoring for about 275 multi-location businesses. And in the sort of Places Scout data scrape that was the input, they did it actually on an individual location basis, not just brands overall. So in total, there were more than 200,000 individual locations evaluated against all these criteria. So if we go to the next slide, what are those criteria that I keep alluding to? Yep, there we go. So here they are. There are about 20 of them. They include everything from where individual locations are showing up in search results to, how complete their listings are in places like Google and Facebook and Yelp. And the scoring model itself importantly weighed criteria based on the leading thinking about ranking factors. So the degree to which Google emphasizes and rewards different criteria like profile completeness and other things was very much reflected in the scoring model and the proportionate scores we gave each criteria when devising the model. So if we go to the next slide, in that respect, there's the question of what was different this year. So many of the individual criteria we saw on the previous slide were weighted differently this year relative to past years based on the relative importance they have as ranking factors. And as we all know, that's sort of a moving target. But in addition to those sort of proportionate shifts in scoring weight, there was a much larger structural change we made this year that I alluded to earlier, which is bisecting the model into two main categories, which are search and social. And the point here was really to give them each adequate focus in terms of their impact on overall localized marketing performance. So because they vary a great deal, as we'll get into in a bit, some companies excelled at one versus the other. So delineating them allows us to better achieve the LMBR's mission, which, as I mentioned, is to quantify localized marketing performance and allow companies to sort of isolate where they need improvement. So the second big update to this year's model was to introduce another scoring construct to further sort of contextualize a given company's performance, and that's what we call the maturity model. So if we go to the next slide, this doesn't introduce new scoring. The same scores that are the outputs of the LMBR that I sort of outlined are still used here, but they flow into this maturity model. So depending on your score, you're identified as being within one of these life cycle stages. And I won't read through them all here, but they sort of map to the levels of sophistication and maturity for localized marketing. And we'll be sort of invoking this model throughout this presentation, again, to really just further contextualize what a given score means in terms of actionable areas of improvement and sort of where companies are in that overall journey. And it's also important to note that the maturity model can be applied to a company's overall score, or their search score, or their social score, or their score in any one of those individual criteria. So the point is that companies can be at various stages of the maturity model in different areas of their marketing mix. And Monica's going to sort of demonstrate that in a bit. So if we go to the next slide, so with that sort of, backdrop of, the more kind of meta or procedural kind of aspects of the study, what were some of the takeaways? So Monica's going to go into a lot of sort of detailed results in a bit, but at a high level, there are a few things to sort of underscore here. So first, the LMBR benchmark, which is the average score, actually declined from last year's study, and we attribute that to a few factors. So one, the new scoring model I just outlined, there were additional sort of social categories fleshed out and incorporated that weren't in last year's study. So that sort of dragged down the overall average because, as I'll go over in a minute, brands are actually scoring lower in the aggregate with social versus search. And that was an interesting finding. So number two, in terms of, what is, some of the takeaways. One of the sort of elephants in the room, of course, is COVID-19. It's been a challenging year, of course, for local businesses. So they had their hands full with simply staying alive. So that, to some degree, we believe, distracted from some of the rigors of local marketing. And that could be also attributed for that slight dip in the benchmark from last year. But we expect that to rebound as the world itself does. Now, if we go to the next slide, some of the other sort of top level takeaways are the fact that localized marketing sophistication very much varies by things like category and channel. And again, Monica will sort of demonstrate that with some of the actual scores in a minute. So you'll see what that looks like. But at a high level, the top 3 scoring criteria, or categories, excuse me, this year were retail, auto, and personal care. The lowest scoring categories were property management, cleaning services, and real estate. And across all categories, companies in the aggregate scored better, excuse me, in search versus social, as I alluded to earlier. And this was a key finding because it signals greater maturity in search versus social overall. And in some cases, we've theorized that it takes a lot more rigor and frequent behavior to stay on top of one's sort of social game in terms of some of the social scoring criteria, things like responding to reviews. So in some cases, these social criteria are inherently more challenging for local businesses to score high and therefore represent areas of improvement. And then lastly, in terms of just findings, one of our key findings is that there is a correlation, not surprisingly, between LMBR score and revenue. So the top 10 scorers in LMBR averaged 22% year-over-year revenue growth, which is 3x the rest of the field. And Monica will illustrate that a bit more in a bit. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to switch gears here and talk about sort of like the why. Why is localized marketing important? Otherwise your LMBR score is just a number. And of course it's not. This is something that has real world impact. So then if we go to the next slide, first of all, as we like to say, all commerce is local. So even in a pandemic, local is where business happens. According to Forrester, 86% of marketers believe that consumers look for local business information via search and social channels. And 74% believe that those same channels are the primary places that serve location-specific info. If we go to the next slide, putting some more figures behind that, 25% of consumers now say that they discover new brands and products through social channels, and 78% of purchase decisions are influenced in social, and in favor of having location-specific social posts versus generic or national content, local posts are getting 67% more engagement on average. So that's social. What about search? If we go to the next slide, please. For search, half of queries have local intent, and of the local searches done, 95% contain actual local results, such as Google's 3-pack. So the reasons for showing up there continue to become more evident and prevalent, and that's done through lots of the search marketing factors that we'll kind of go over, the things we're scoring in this study. So if we go to the next slide, winding down here a bit, one of the ways that LMBR is modeled is to correlate to the consumer journey and the marketing funnel that we all know and love. So that's, as we know, a sort of convoluted process that goes from product awareness to purchase and involves many steps along the way that essentially define and drive localized marketing. But if we go to the next slide, this sort of consumer process maps to the LMBR and the main categories that we've set up. So there's certainly overlap, but in a broader sense, there are segments of that process that involve social and search respectively. So social correlates to brand building and cultivating customer relationships. Search, meanwhile, happens in lower funnel stages typically when consumers are in that consideration or high intent sort of purchasing mode. So this really is meant to underscore overall that both search and social are not only critical sort of in isolation, but they also feed into each other where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And we saw that throughout the results of this study. And that notion is just, it's validated by the LMBR results. So speaking of the results, without further delay, I'll turn it over to Monica to take you through kind of what we came up with in greater detail. But meanwhile, hopefully this has been valuable to sort of contextualize or set the stage for the study and why it's important. So Monica, over to you for the fun parts.
Thank you so much, Mike, for all of that great data. And sorry, guys, I wanted to make sure my camera was on, so sorry for the flipping of screens. But really excited to now share some of the detailed findings in this research from 2021. One of the things I'll emphasize before getting into the details here is that when we started this research project 3 years ago, one of the big things that both Localogy and SOCi was realizing is that, localized marketing was a huge opportunity for marketers. But what we were seeing was that a lot of those large multi-location businesses were leaving a lot of the opportunity on the table, or that was our hypothesis. Because we were seeing a lot of movement, a lot of investment in this area by the bigger search and social platforms. And when we looked at some of these areas and we were just looking brand by brand, we just didn't see that these areas were being fully leveraged and really the opportunity realized. So when we set out to do this research, we were trying to prove, do multi-location marketers really understand the importance of these areas of marketing? And if so, how well are they leveraging it, right? And again, that ties back to the score and the overall maturity model that Michael talked about. So in this year's research, what we found is that on average, across over 275 large multi-location businesses that we studied and audited, on average, those multi-location businesses are scoring an average of 43 points out of 100 total points. What that really means is that most multi-location marketers are still building the core components of their localized marketing programs, as you can see by the maturity model. There's still a lot of opportunity on the table. Again, this scoring is based on 100 points. So, 43 is good. It's a healthy program. It means that most of these businesses are investing in the core capabilities needed to have a very competitive and healthy presence across these really important channels. One of the things that I think is definitely driving kind of the middle range score, and Michael talked to this before, is that, again, you can see these through the averages here. What we're finding is that a lot of multi-location marketers are a lot more comfortable in investing more in their localized search marketing programs. That makes sense. Localized search has been on the scene for a very long time. I think it's very easy to now deploy those campaigns, see the results of those campaigns. So it's not surprising, I guess, that marketers are scoring higher when you compare their localized search visibility to localized social. As you can see here, as we break down the localized social score, it is significantly less than what we're seeing for search at 34 points. And it's the two scores combined that make the overall average, okay? So again, as Michael had mentioned, we're seeing a greater sophistication in search than social. Why this is important and why I love that we separated the scores this year is because, again, based on the changes in how consumers are, looking for information, how they're discovering new products and services, and then how they're ultimately purchasing, has really changed over the years. And especially because of COVID, really a lot of our purchase journey is happening in these digital channels. And I think if marketers don't realize that, yes, localized search is so important. When you have a defined need, that's the first place you're going to turn to find out where to buy. But where is that discovery taking place? When somebody, maybe they're just looking to catch up with their community or news, where is a lot of that discovery and awareness taking place? Well, a lot of it's taking place in social, because that's where a lot of us are spending the majority of our time. So it's really important that marketers understand that there should be equal investment in these two very important digital channels. So diving a little bit deeper into some of the findings, again, this is a lot to look at. It's one of the visuals that I'm going to continue to work on to try and make clear. But essentially what this is showing is that in addition to the revenue correlation that we saw in this year's research, again, the top scorers are growing 3 times faster than the average multi-location business. We also saw performance differences based on this stage of sophistication in a marketer's localized marketing program. So what this chart is representing is kind of just one criteria being pulled out from the localized social audit and one criteria being pulled out from the localized social audit, and saying, okay, if we were to look at the brands that are scoring in these different stages, do their performance levels change? And again, this is just one of many scoring criteria that we looked at. It's not to mean that for localized social, the only criteria you need to worry about is high valued engagements, or over here in search, the only thing you need to worry about is 3-pack visibility. That's not what this is saying. But there is a meaningful and measurable difference between the maturity. So again, if a brand is in the learning stages of their localized marketing maturity, it just means they haven't really put enough rigor into the program yet. They're still leaving some of those core localized marketing components on the table. And as a result, when you look across social, they're not seeing very many high valued engagements. They're not seeing great performance in the different things that they're doing. We can see the same over here on social. For those businesses that are still in the learning stages, they haven't put the rigor or the investment into the programs. We're seeing less than 10% 3-pack visibility for their primary keyword and category. But for those in comparison that are maybe a little bit further along in their journey, let's compare that to standardizing. So those brands that are scoring in the 60 to 80 points out of 100, we see on average they're getting about 23 high valued engagements per local page for the things that they're doing in social. And then over here in search, they're seeing over 45%, almost 50% 3-pack visibility for their primary category and keyword. Again, this is just one of the factors that we looked at, but I did want to kind of showcase that, for marketers, when you ask yourself, well, what's in it for me? Do I really care about this? This is what's at stake. What's at stake is not just your visibility and your ability to get in that consideration set with that customer, but it's also you have the ability to make these channels work so much better for you and driving that awareness, that discovery, all the way through to that conversion. So hopefully that was clear. To emphasize what Michael had said ultimately, the big finding, and again, this is the 3rd year in a row that we've seen this correlation. Those top, scores are growing their business revenues faster than those that aren't leveraging these channels. Again, what's in it for you as a marketer? Is your business growth important? I would think everybody would say yes. And so that's why you can't leave this opportunity on the table. All right, so the actual research, if you download the report, you guys, there's so much data. We really just don't have time to go through everything in this webinar. So what we thought we would do to kind of showcase some of these results is show you some of the averages we saw by channel when we look at, what are some of the scoring criteria and averages when we look social versus search. And then we're also going to break down what that might look like for a specific category. So we're going to start with the channels first. As I mentioned before, in localized social marketing, very important piece of your digital marketing, visibility, your presence as a brand. Yet 34 points out of 100 is the average that that most brands are scoring, which means that they're still developing their social marketing programs. And this isn't a surprise. I think a lot of marketers still struggle with social. Where does it fit? How should they be measuring it? What's the right ways to do it? And I think hopefully some of this research that we have coming out from the LMBR will help answer a lot of those questions. So today, on average, in the developing stages of your journey, we're seeing most multi-location marketers are getting some good high-valued engagements for the content that they're putting out into market. And when I say high-valued engagements, what I mean, in social, you can engage your audience in a number of ways. So your audience can like your page, they can react to your content, like, leave a smiley face or a thumbs up. They can also do a high-valued engagement. And when I say high-valued engagement, it means that they are either commenting or sharing your content. That's kind of the ultimate That's the ultimate metric, I would say, in social is, are you getting that true engagement from your community? Because if you are, what you're really going to realize out of your social marketing programs is the original promise of social, which was, you could put content out there and you not only got that, seen and that reach from your community, but that extended community. So your content, had great awareness, and that is still the case in social, but you have to now work for it. When Facebook made that algorithm change, they basically said they're not going to just give you the extension of, where your content is going to be seen by your audience and the extended audience. Only if your audience really likes that content and they're showing that true engagement will you really get that true benefit of the extended distribution. So that's really what we're talking about when we say high valued engagements. Sorry that I didn't explain that sooner. So when we look at the localized social criteria that we audited in this year's LMBR research, this is kind of a summary of what that looked like. So I won't go through it all in too much detail, but what you can see here is we really audited how these brands were performing in both Facebook and Google My Business. Those are two of the most important channels as it relates to actual business engagements on social. So that's why we kind of concentrated in these two areas. And then you can see on average what we're starting to see here in terms of on posting frequency. What's the average? On Facebook, it's about 9 posts a month versus Google, we're seeing multi-location businesses only posting once a month. On locations responding to reviews, we're seeing that on Facebook, about 49% of locations are actually responding to reviews on Facebook versus 62% in Google My Business. And then you can see down to engagements, kind of the averages that we're seeing. So overall, when we looked at social, really, we see there's a lot of opportunity here to kind of increase these programs. First, in the number of locations that are participating and posting to these social channels. Again, it's one of the best ways to build that connection with your local community, as well as drive that awareness and discovery. 2, investing more time into your social ratings and reviews, reducing the average time it takes to respond to those really critical reviews and sometimes even those comments and questions that are coming in. And then finally, we see a big area of opportunity in investing more time and in developing and testing more localized content to help these marketers drive those high valued engagements from their local communities. And again, realize the full potential of what social marketing has to offer. When we looked across all the brands that we studied, we were actually able to see 10 brands that kind of rose to the top when it looks at, when we look at those brands that are fully leveraging social. And you can see those brands here to the left and their scores right to the right. So for all 10 of these brands, which include Planet Fitness, Sonic, Arby's, Great Clips, etc., you'll notice that they're way over here to the optimizing stages of their social marketing programs. And as a result, we saw a multiplication of those high valued engagements coming out of everything they were doing in social versus some of the more average programs that we saw. Looking across the search marketing programs that we audited, as mentioned before, we see the average multi-location business is investing a little bit more in this area. As a result, they're in the building stages of this program, scoring between 40 to 60 points out of 100. And on average, the typical multi-location business that's in the building stages of their program, they're seeing about 27% 3-pack visibility for their primary category and keyword. Again, kind of shows that, although they're building, they're getting some good performance out of the search channel, but there's lots of opportunity to improve. So in terms of looking at some of these factors, a summary of some of these, again, we looked across both Google My Business, Facebook, and Yelp. We included Yelp here because they're still a very important local page, driving a lot of search traffic through the Apple partnership, as well as just direct app traffic. So when you look across all of the different factors, we see lots of opportunity in search still for multi-location marketers to increase, kind of the visibility in their programs. And we see opportunity in local profile management. So there are cases where, a lot of businesses aren't fully leveraging their local profiles and taking advantage of areas like, putting not only your primary category in your profile, but what are some of the secondary categories or keywords that your business represents, making sure your hours of operation are in your profile, etc. More attention should be paid to claiming and optimizing these pages and profiles. And we saw that across these three big channels. And then finally, more focus should be given to increasing the percentage of reviews responded to, and again, reducing the amount of time it takes to respond. I got this question on another review of this data. Somebody had asked, well, why do these response times look so high? The typical consumer, when they post a review or a critical comment, they actually expect a response from a business within 24 hours. And my language here is important. When I say critical, I mean, I'm upset, I didn't have a good experience. And for those, you have to get back to somebody really fast. I think when we look at that, there's still some improvement. Definitely multi-location brands are not, under that 24-hour. We're talking days, so there's still improvement there. But even on the, middle of the road or even happy responses, I think it's still a good practice to make sure that you're responding to those reviewers, thanking them for taking the time to write a review for you. So understand that the response rate here is just taking into account both positive and critical reviews and comments, questions, but we do have data to break out just the critical ones as well. And then finally, again, the way that you should be looking at this is just, these are the averages. It's really just showing where there's opportunity to increase. Again, when we look at the top 10 brands that we saw were fully leveraging localized search and their presence to the fullest, we see some different brands come up here: Batteries Plus, Pet Supplies, Urban Air Adventures. You'll notice that the top brands in social versus search look very different. And that's because we didn't really have a lot of the same brands that we saw were fully leveraging both channels. What was really interesting and a big finding of this research is that what we saw was, there were brands that were fully leveraging their search presence and then not so much in social, or vice versa. You had other brands that were fully leveraging social and not so much in search. So again, we are definitely seeing those differences, and it's just something to be aware of and something to hopefully get more in line in the coming years, so that you're fully realizing the benefit of the commerce that's coming out of both of these channels. To showcase a category, again, a lot of the results we showed so far to date are showing the averages of all of the brands studied. So you're getting that average for the multi-location business segment in totality. But we also break down the benchmarks by category. So we've studied several categories as part of the research. It's a lot to look at on this slide, but this is just a summary of some of these categories and how they're scoring in both social, search, and then the combined score, which you see kind of in the middle. And so you can see the variance in sophistication across all of these different categories. To give an example, we'll kind of highlight the restaurants category, but again, if you are interested in seeing the benchmarks for some of the other industries, please download the research. It has every single industry split out like you're going to see here for restaurants. So for restaurants, we're seeing that this is a category that is actually, the average score is above the multi-location benchmark. So restaurant marketers are better leveraging these channels than the average multi-location brand, scoring at almost 50 points. They're still in the building stages of their program. Again, both in localized search and local social, they are scoring higher than the average. But again, like we saw for the multi-location average, a lot more sophistication in search than social. What does this look like when we look at their actual benchmarks at the category level? So you can see, again, how we're looking at this is the benchmark is on the left, and then the restaurant category benchmark is on the right. So for Facebook, you can see that there's a lot more locations posting than the average multi-location brand. Restaurants are about on point with frequency of posting when you look at Facebook. When you look at some of these other places like responding to reviews, they're doing better. One thing I'll highlight for social, which is really important, is I think restaurants have really worked a lot on the content and the ways that they are using social to engage their audience. Again, you have to think about restaurants. It's not kind of that one and done purchase. It's that purchase that you want, somebody's gonna, come to your restaurant, you want them to come back, or you want new users to come in and come to you frequently. So I think restaurants have done a really good job at not only leveraging these channels, but finding ways to get this really important engagement out of the things that they're doing. So they have like 3 times the high valued engagements that they're seeing per local page than the average multi-location brand. What that means in essence is that they're going to get a lot more reach, a lot more value out of these programs than what we're seeing out of some other categories and the average brand. In terms of localized search, very sophisticated in search versus the multi-location average. But again, they're still scoring in the building stages. So there's a lot of components of a localized social program that are still good areas of opportunity. I'll point out one here when looking at the benchmark against the restaurant category average. We are seeing lower average star ratings across these big profiles versus what we're seeing across the other multi-location marketers. However, we're seeing great, claiming of listings and profile completion. So again, it just kind of showcases how some of this might look a little bit different by category. So again, really used to kind of showcase where again, a business in terms of a category or a brand in particular, where are you competitive and you're kind of hitting those benchmarks? Where are you below in those benchmarks? And really, where are there areas of opportunity for your program? That's really how these benchmarks should be used. So what did we learn out of this research? Well, when done effectively, we know localized marketing can do a couple of things that are amazing for your brand. One, as we saw with the 3-pack results, it can propel your brand to the top of organic search results. And for those of us that have been doing, search, organic, paid for a long time, that is kind of table stakes. So it's really important that you know how to get ranked. It helps you build and maintain a highly engaged base of loyal customers, like we saw in social. Really what we're trying to achieve in social is building that connection with your local community and potential customers, and then getting them to engage back with you through that very valuable, hopefully localized content. And then ultimately using both of these channels to drive increased traffic and sales to each one of your local businesses. We also learned that this scoring is not just a point of pride. So if you have a high LMBR score, it's not just like, oh, congratulations. It's not just a point of pride, but it actually maps to real results and revenue outcomes. As Michael had talked about before, LMBR top scores are seeing 3 times the revenue growth rate, but then also, as I showcased in some of the details, they're achieving over 70% visibility in Google 3-pack results and 5 times the high valued engagements coming out of their localized social pages and channel. And again, that's measurable, that's meaningful, and hopefully kind of answers that question, what's in it for me and why is it worth it? Finally, key areas that marketers should cultivate to increase their performance and visibility. As Michael mentioned earlier, it's consistency in these channels. Again, one of the big trends that we saw is that there's a lot more maturity and comfort in search than there is social. We've got to get that up to parity. Social is extremely important, especially now when more and more consumers are spending almost all of their time in these channels, and amazing discovery is happening in these channels, so much so that commerce out of social is rising hand over fist. So don't leave that opportunity on the table. Responding to reviews. Again, we're talking about search and social here, but in both of those important channels, your reviews, your local ratings and reviews run throughout both of those important channels and really affect not only your ranking, but also how consumers view you as a business. So making sure you're responding to your reviews with both comprehensiveness and speed to help impact your rankings, and then also drive the strong customer relationships. And then finally, we are definitely seeing that some of the social features in really highly trafficked, important platforms like Google and your Google My Business profile I'll mention Google Posts, Q&A are going very underutilized. And these are really core areas that you can take advantage of today at no cost. It's there for you. Your community is already engaging. The average localized business location has 2 to 4 Q&As already posted, and just 10% of those Q&As are responded to by the business owner. So big areas for you to look at, take advantage of, and use for your business. So to wrap up, I know we've gone through like the overall benchmarks and the scoring. What we always get asked after we release this research is, if I'm a business, how do I see my score, or how can I get scored to see how I am, doing against these benchmarks? The great news is there's a site. You can go to lmbr2021.com, and then you can request your brand's specific audit. And what you're going to get with that is a score on how you're doing in both localized social and localized search. You'll be able to compare how you scored against not only the multi-location benchmark average, but your category averages as well. And then finally, you'll get a nice summary of your program strengths and then areas of opportunity. So if you're interested in that, please take advantage of it. It's free. It'll help you kind of translate what this research means to your business, and hopefully make this information and this insight very valuable and helpful to your business. So with that, I do think we have some time for some questions.
Yes, we did have a few come in, so I'll go ahead and start. The first one that was asked is, are the top 10 brands in 2021 similar brands to 2020's report?
No. What's interesting, and we've seen this 3 years in a row, so I didn't really call it out in the slides, and Michael and I probably should have done this, but what we found is the scoring criteria that we use for the benchmark actually changes every year. And a lot of folks that are in the space, whether you're doing local SEO or you're just optimizing profiles in your listings, know this space changes all the time. So every year, our ranking factors or the scoring criteria that we're using changes. The number of criteria we look at has changed, and the actual weighting of what each thing is worth has been changing. So that's such a good question, because we've seen such flux year over year of the brands that are scoring highest. And really what that is translating, or how to translate that, is that this is not a set it and forget it area. This is an area that requires ongoing optimization and focus. And it's really those brands that are on top of the changes that are happening in the landscape. They're the ones that are going to keep pace with these really important channels and making sure that their brand is always visible. And again, I think reports and research like this is here to help you see how that's changed over the last year, and then make the finer tweaks and adjustments to your program. So if you are dropping, you can figure that out and make those changes now.
Okay, great. The next question I had is there any correlation to the age of the company relating to focus on social versus search?
That's a great question too. So no, and I'll tell you, when we looked at the businesses that we studied, and it's in the methodology that Mike covered, but we looked at the top 200 largest franchise marketers, and we looked at the top 100 fastest growing, which means they're not that big, but their growth rate's really fast. So we included both lists in the study of the brands that we looked at, and we didn't see a correlation there. Again, it's not, I don't think it's so for instance, if a brand has been in search and social for 10 years versus a brand that's been in search and social for 5 years, does this brand over here, because they've got that 10 years, are they just scoring higher? No. We are seeing some young, new brands that have really kind of come into market probably within the last 5 years, score very high in the LMBR. And then you've got some of these really sophisticated brands that have been around for years, decades, and they're not scoring well at all. So again, I hope that answers the question, but we did not see a correlation there.
Okay, great. We'll do one more. What are your thoughts on why retail is the most sophisticated in search and social compared to other industries?
I think what we saw in the categories that were performing really well versus those that aren't, I think the categories that are a lot more sophisticated in these channels are the ones that they're getting that that repeat business. They're kind of seeing, you know, how these channels are kind of shaping if people find them or not. For instance, you know, if you think about like retail, how much retail shopping has changed. I mean, I will tell you my own habits. You know, when I go to my social channels, I'm actually going there to catch up, to see what people are doing. You know, sometimes, you know, kill some time if I'm waiting in a doctor's office or whatever. I've got 2 teenagers, so I'm often waiting for them to come out of practice. And so I'm on my social channels. I'm not there to make a purchase, but then, you know, all of a sudden, you know, I see this great swimsuit and I'm about to go on vacation, and I didn't do a search for swimsuit. It was just part of my feed. Again, what's great about social is that they really can serve you content based on your interests. And, you know, then I'm buying the swimsuit and I didn't intend to do that. And so again, when you look at I think the categories that have really transformed their businesses, especially during COVID, retail, restaurants specifically, I don't think it's a surprise that they're really leveraging these channels because they really had to. And then there's other categories that, again, I think they've been leveraging these categories or these channels, but they're just not investing as much time. I don't think that they see it as critical to their business, although, you know, based on the results, we know they are. But that's why I think you're seeing retail, restaurants, you know, personal care services, those type of categories rise to the top.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to thank you, Monica and Mike, and the whole SOCi team. Great questions and discussion, and the presentation was wonderful. So thanks again to SOCi for putting together the webinar for us today.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for joining today's session.
Just a few more items from Localogy before we end today's webinar. You will be able to view today's broadcast along with previous webinars on our website, localogy.com. Just navigate to Research and Resources and drop down to Webinars. Localogy is excited to share that we have a virtual conference coming up on May 17th, Place Redefined 2021, with speakers from TikTok, Fiverr, MasterCard, Roku, and many more. To find out more information, please go to resource.localogy.com/place-2021. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please be sure to visit localogy.com and subscribe for updates to be the first to know about future webinars. Have a great day, everyone.